Mr. President, I rise today to speak about a bipartisan amendment, number 3778, which Senator Lugar and I have filed based on our bill, the Fair Access to Credit Scores Act of 2010. This amendment, Mr. President, has wide and growing support, both with consumer groups and legislators of all political persuasions. And I want to thank Senators Bond, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Hagan, Levin, Lieberman, McCaskill, and Shaheen, who are also sponsors of this amendment. Our amendment takes a common sense yet significant step toward putting consumers back in control of their finances by offering Americans annual access to their credit score when they access their free annual credit report. Now, Mr. President, I want to clarify here, because this is what's important about this amendment. A credit report tells consumers what outstanding credit accounts they have open, like student loans, credit cards, even perhaps a car or a home loan. Unfortunately, it tells Americans little else. Your credit score, on the other hand, which our legislation makes available, has the critical information that consumers need to know. A credit score affects consumers' interest rates, monthly payments on home loans, and could be the difference between whether a child is able to afford college or not. Credit scores even affect a consumer's ability to buy a car, rent an apartment, and get a phone or even internet service. In 2003, Congress enacted legislation requiring the three major consumer credit reporting agencies to provide a free annual credit report to consumers. This law, known as the FACT Act, was an important step in ensuring that the financial records of American consumers are accurate. However, since that time, many of my constituents have been misled to believe that they have free access to their credit score when what they have is free access to their credit report. So you have the score versus the report. Even thoughtful lawmakers in the Congress do not realize that American consumers ultimately have to buy access to their credit score. To be clear, banks and lenders can easily obtain these scores while consumers cannot. That simply, Mr. President, is not fair. We've all seen the frequent television commercials or internet advertisements which claim to offer consumers free access to their credit score. Unfortunately, consumers are often disappointed to learn they only have access to their credit report, not the critical information that they need to judge their own credit worthiness, their score. And in the most troubling cases, consumers often believe they are signing up to get a free credit score, only to find out later that they unwittingly signed up for a costly monthly monitoring service that can cost nearly $200 a year. In considering reforms to hold Wall Street accountable and rein in their dealings, we believe that the Congress should also work to protect consumers from other unscrupulous financial practices. When there's a deal that often seems too good to be true, many Americans ask themselves, what's the catch? Well, there certainly is a catch in this instance. And the problem is that federal law tacitly supports it by directing consumers to these credit rating agencies under false pretenses. We all know that consumers want their score, but it's the last thing they receive. We are literally sending Americans every day into a fine print trap. Well, I'm not surprised the credit reporting agencies and their lobbyists have been hard at work over the last several days perpetuating these fine print arguments in opposing our amendment. They even claim, Mr. President, that the credit scores belong to them, not the consumers whose livelihood depends on them. Would a doctor say, Mr. President, that someone's blood pressure reading is their information, not the patient's? And so these agencies have also been circulating a document opposing our effort because, according to them, it would not provide consumers any greater benefit than already available. Mr. President, something is up. They oppose our bill because it doesn't offer consumers enough benefits. This is precisely the kind of misleading information included in their advertisements, as you see here in this photograph. While this snapshot does not fully reflect the deception in this particular ad, it does picture a squirrel directing consumers to one of the websites claiming to offer a free credit score. But there's more to the story. While it patently seems to offer a free score, this credit reporting agency requires consumers to enter their credit card information and registers them for a costly credit monitoring service. You have to look closely at the top of the ad to read the fine print that actually tells consumers the real story. They have to subscribe to the company's service to receive the actual credit score. You've probably seen this commercial, Mr. President, which tells a sad story about an individual whose poor credit score landed him in a dead-end job. If only he had access to his credit score, the ad explains with a catchy jingle, he would have been able to take action and improve his credit and his quality of life. Again, though, you have to look closely to read the fine print. If the consumer goes to this site, they once again have to enter their credit card information and are registered for a service costing nearly $200 a year, rather. It says here, Mr. President, in fine print, free credit score and report with enrollment in Triple Advantage. Ironically, these credit reporting agencies are walking the halls of Congress telling members that our bill is somehow, and I quote, unfair and unfounded. They want to protect a federal law that has given them a monopoly on this information and continues to direct unwitting consumers their way. We agree, those of us who have sponsored this piece of legislation, with these credit reporting agencies that a credit score is important information. And perhaps their misleading ads, if anything, have convinced consumers they need to know this information. However, luring hardworking Americans into a costly credit monitoring service is simply not fair, especially when federal law nudges consumers in their direction. Now, Mr. President, we've all come to the floor this week from both sides of the aisle explaining what we want to do to protect consumers and do what is right for Main Street. We have a chance to right this wrong here and now this week. Put simply, this amendment accomplishes what the television commercials and their fine print caveats have deceptively claimed for years, the offer of a free credit score. That's why the Consumer Federation of America and the Consumers Union and a wide range of consumer advocates support this legislation. While free access to a consumer's credit score is only a small part of the larger reforms that are needed, it addresses one of the fundamental inequities that pervade the current financial system. Put simply, our one-sided marketplace today is often rigged to benefit large financial institutions at the expense of hardworking Americans struggling to support their families and save for retirement. If we want to empower Americans to reclaim their financial health, we have to start with a dose of transparency. When so much is at stake, this amendment is a small step that will help restore balance and give Americans the tools they need to take back control of their personal finances. My hope, my strong hope, Mr. President, is that we'll be able to vote on this important amendment in order to restore an even greater dose of fairness to consumers in my state of Colorado and all around the nation. I urge and request that each one of my colleagues support its passage.
Senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Well, Mr. President, just very briefly, let me say to our colleague from Colorado that I appreciate his efforts in this regard, and where you and Senator Lugar and others who worked on this, and you're absolutely right. People ought to have a right to know what their credit scores are. They're critical when it comes to that home mortgage. The interest rates that you pay, the down payments you're required to meet, are all linked to what that credit score is. And we've seen in the past how credit scores can actually be very different than what they should be, where people have had to fight for years to get a credit score restored because of either identity theft, all sorts of things that can happen. We had a hearing not too many years ago on this issue where the theft of identity caused an individual to have a person who just ran wild with some credit cards. The individual who had his credit card stolen then spent years trying to rehabilitate his own name and reputation because of what had happened, and could never get access to his credit scores, except that every financial transaction he went to engage in, he paid an awful price because the credit scores were obviously low in light of the fact that people who had stolen his cards had run up huge debts. So his mortgage rates, everything else he was involved in where an interest rate was involved, he was paying and his family paying a price for it. So aside from having the knowledge of what it is, the ability to correct it as well is something we've spent a lot of time on. And there's hardly an American citizen in this country who, at one point or another, hasn't run into this difficulty. And today, in an era when so much of our well-being depends upon our credit scores, how we're rated in these matters, this becomes a critical opponent. And people ought to know, what is my credit score? Why is it the score it is? And so they can either strengthen it or at least understand why they're being charged the various rates they are. So I commend my friend from Colorado and Senator Lugar, and you mentioned there are others who are on the bill with you as well, or the amendment as well, and I thank you for raising it. And in the coming days, my hope is here we'll be able to provide you some time to further debate it if you so desire, and maybe get an agreement to adopt your amendment as well.
Mr. President,
Senator from Colorado is recognized.
I want to thank the Banking Committee Chairman for his interest in this bipartisan amendment. I take to heart his comments on the importance of having access to your credit score. We all have access, as I pointed out, to our credit reports. Those are important, but frankly, you ought to understand what's in your credit report. It's the loans, it's the financial obligations and liabilities you have. It's much harder to get your credit score. We hear a lot about financial literacy, about taking control of your own destiny when it comes to your financial future. This would be an important tool to have in the hands of consumers. The agencies and the institutions, Mr. Chairman, that develop these scores are saying, as I said in my speech, that this is unfair and unfounded, but they've found, frankly, when they made the credit reports available on a one-time basis annually for free, that it actually created more traffic and more business. And I would predict that when you get your score that one time each year for free, you're going to want to check over time on that score, and that's going to create some additional business for these companies. Much like when I go to my ATM, I'm always curious about the flow in and out of my checking account, and sometimes I check the last 10 transactions. That results in a little bit of income stream to the bank. I don't resent that because I have information at hand, but when I was given the opportunity to have that information initially, that triggered a greater interest in being more financially engaged. So I think this is common sense based. Obviously, the bipartisan support we have shows that there's widespread support for this idea, and I thank the chairman again for his interest and his support.
I thank.
And I yield the floor.